Good morning. Today we begin the book of Judges. We look at the first 3 chapters. And this book of Judges is a transitional time for the Israelites. They have come into the promised land. Moses led them to the border. Joshua was the leader as they conquered. It sounded like, as we read the last of Joshua, that they had completely conquered the promised land. We find out as we begin Judges that that wasn't true. There were many people that had not yet been displaced, and they continued to live amongst the Israelites and caused problems for the Israelites. Of course they did. But Moses was gone, Joshua was gone, and the peoples, as they were settling their different lands, were trying to figure out who they were, or their autonomy. Even this new generation now that had not been slaves in Egypt really didn't know how to live, to farm, to raise their crops. They knew how to take care of their animals. They had flocks as they were, moving through the wilderness and everything, but it was still a time of growing, a time of, figuring out who they are. And I think about that in relationship to us, as we grow up, we go to school to be educated and to figure out who we want to be, and then we spend the rest of our lives trying to be that person, or maybe trying to adapt that person to who it is that we're going to be. And so the Israelites are struggling in this book of Judges. They don't have a king. They don't have really a centralized government. Jerusalem isn't a part of the kingdom yet. That doesn't become a part of Israel until the time of King David, which, is going to come a little bit later. But it's there's a lot of growing pains is what the book of Judges is about. And we find those growing pains all the way through all of the history books of the Israelites. And we find those growing pains very much even in today's society. They're just there. But anyway, chapter 1, begins after the death of Joshua. The Israelites inquired of the Lord, who will stand for us against these Canaanites to fight against them? And God responded, Judah will go up against them. And Judah gets one more to go with him. And they go, excuse me. You know how sometimes we strive in life to catch things? Well, we don't strive to catch a cold. Well, I got one anyway. But anyway, Joshua says to Simeon, come with me, and we may fight against the Canaanites. And they go. And Judah went, and the Lord, it says, gave the Canaanites and the Perizzites into their hand, and they defeated 10,000 of them at Bezek. And Bezek later becomes known as Bethel. It's one of those things that we hear this word here, and then it's kind of gone again, I think. So after this, it says Adonibezek fled, and they pursued him, caught him, cut off his thumbs and his big toes, and then it's 70 kings with their thumbs and big toes cut off. He used to pick scrap, and so God has paid me back, So it was, they cut off his thumbs and his big toes, and it sounds just crazy, but it was what he had done to others that he had defeated in the past. So it was, what goes around comes around, kind of that type of deal. The people of Judah fought against Jerusalem, it says, and they took it. But afterwards, the people went down to fight against the Canaanites. And so there's discrepancy here. It says they fought against Jerusalem and took it, but we're going to find out that, Jerusalem wasn't definitely a part of Israel until, as I mentioned earlier, the time of King David. And the Judites go against the Canaanites who lived in Hebron. And from there it goes to these others. So there's continuing battles here of, even after the death of Joshua, that they're trying to claim the land and to drive the people out. Although many times when they claim the land, they don't drive all of the people out. And we find that out as we read here too. In verse 19 it says, the Lord was with Judah. He took possession of the hill country, but he could not drive out the inhabitants of the plain. Excuse me. So the Jebusites continued to live in Jerusalem, and they have lived in Jerusalem until that day. And so here is where we see again that, they didn't totally capture Jerusalem. They may have gone against it, but the Jebusites retained control and lived there. Verse 22, the house of Joseph went up against Bethel. Now it's Bethel, and the Lord was with them. He sent spies, and the spies coming out said, show us the way and we'll deal kindly with you. And so again here they used residents of the cities, residents of the lands, to spy it out and to help defeat them. And in verse 27, Manasseh did not drive out the inhabitants of Bethshean and its villages, so they continued to live in their midst. But they did put these people to forced labor. They were more or less slaves. But, verse 28 says, but they did not, in fact, drive them out. And this was God's instruction. Drive them out. Take possession of the land. Displace these people. Take away all of this potential temptation and get rid of their gods and get rid of their idols and, just keep yourselves separated from them. But they didn't do that. And verse 29, Ephraim did not drive out the Canaanites in Gezer, but the Israelites lived amongst them. Zebulun did not drive out the inhabitants of Kitron. Asher didn't drive out the inhabitants. So we see that continuing here, that as the tribes go to possess their land, they don't drive the people out. Naphtali didn't drive them out. The Amorites pressed the Danites back into the hill country, and we read that the Danites had been given this land and they wanted more. Well, they lost the land they had and they moved to north. And, so there's just continual struggle, growing pains here. And chapter 22 begins with the angel of the Lord went up and reminds them, I brought you out of the land of Egypt. I brought you to this land. And I said, I will never break my covenant with you. For your part, do not make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land. Separate yourselves from them. And then, but you have not obeyed my command. This is God speaking to the people. You have forgotten what I told you. You're not doing as you're supposed to. And it's kind of like, have you ever said to your kids or grandkids, haven't I ever told you that? Or how many times do I have to tell you? I speak and you don't listen. And it's very evident that, sometimes we don't listen to the problem or the question or the instructions. So, since you have not obeyed me, I will not drive them out before you. They will become adversaries, and their gods will be a snare to you. And so God's telling them, this is what's going to happen. And sure enough, what happens? Just as God said, since you didn't drive these people out, you are worshiping these false idols. You are doing things you should not be doing. And then in verse 8 of chapter 2, we again read, Joshua, son of Nun, died at the age of 110. And so even as Joshua was with them, they hadn't completely driven the people out, and the problems came in. And then verse 11 of chapter 2, the Israelites did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. And they could say that about every one of us, that we did evil in the sight of the Lord. We've all sinned, right? We all have done evil in the sight of the Lord. They worshiped the Baals. They abandoned the Lord, the God of their ancestors. They bowed down to these false idols and provoked the Lord to anger. They abandoned the Lord and worshiped Baal and the Astartes. So the anger of the Lord was kindled against them. And when they marched out to battle, the Lord wasn't with them, and they suffered losses. Verse 16 of chapter 2, God raised up judges who delivered them out of the power of those who plundered them, yet they did not listen to the judges. They didn't have kings. They had judges who were, trying to help remind them of who God was and everything. And verse 26 again, the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel. And it's these growing pains. can't figure out how to follow God properly. And we're the same. Chapter 3, the nations that the Lord left to test all those in Israel who had no experience. They list a lot of these nations of people that are left there, tempting, and then in verse 9, the Israelites cry out to the Lord, and he raises up for them Othniel, and he delivers the Israelites. And it says here, he judged Israel, went to war, and the land rested for 40 years. So they had a peaceful reign for 40 years under Othniel. Othniel dies. The Israelites again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. And we're going to just find that through these judges and through the kings, we know what's going to happen. You know, there are faithful ones, there are unfaithful ones, and the people just vacillate back and forth between listening to their leaders and listening to God. And the growing pains are, I mean, they're really kind of hard to read, all of what happens to these Israelites. Just in through chapter 3, there are 2 or 3 more that are raised up that are faithful to God and rule after him. And in verse 30, Moab was subdued under the hand of Israel. The land rested 80 years. Verse 31, after him came Shagmor, son of Anath, who killed 600 of the Philistines, and he too delivered Israel. So they had a couple back-to-back sometimes that were good judges, but they don't get called kings until the time of Saul, and that's quite a ways down the road yet. So the book of Judges, time of learning, time of growing pains for the people of God.